Hi, my name is Conor Johnstone. I'm a specialist motor and defence solicitor. I wanted to talk a little bit more about blood samples in drug driving cases, how blood is analysed and the potential problems that this can create. Now, the first thing to say is that the legal limits in drugs only apply to blood. There are no legal limits in urine, and that's probably because of the long excretion half-life of most drugs in urine. So when a urine sample is tested, it's practically impossible to say when the drug was consumed and whether that had any impairing effects on the individual. So the law stays well away from urine, and instead the legal limits apply to blood. Now, the method of testing that's used by police laboratories is what's called liquid chromatography tandem mass spectrometry, and it's a two-stage process whereby sample material is first separated by liquid chromatography before being ionised and characterised by mass to change ratio using two mass spectrometers. In plain English, it's just a two-stage process whereby they identify the drug and then they can tell how much of that drug exists. It's a very technical and sensitive method of analysis, and that's why police laboratories have to be ISO accredited. That's an accreditation issued by UCAS, the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, and also regulated by the Forensic Science Regulator. I spend a lot of my time challenging drug driving cases, and it's not uncommon for me to find that the person who actually analysed the blood sample, could be a lab assistant, has less than a year's experience and may have no qualifications whatsoever relating to forensic science. Now, potentially that's a problem when using such a complicated method of testing. And so in any drug driving case, if you're challenging the blood result, you're always entitled to ask for the names, the qualifications, and the level of experience of the people that have been involved in the testing of your blood sample. And that's really important because you can then check whether they've got all the correct training, the correct qualifications, and was that particular laboratory accredited to carry out that particular test. Now, there's three important points to check in any drug driving case. The first relates to analytical variation for standard deviation. What that means is because no one method of testing is 100% accurate, results will always change and vary to a degree, and false positives do occur. You can't stop that from happening. The laboratory has to factor that into the equation when analysing a blood sample, and they have to make a deduction. They have to knock off a certain percentage from the result before that result is reported to the police. Now, with every substance, there's a different deduction that's made. So with alcohol, for example, it's 6% or 6 milligrams, whichever is greater. With cocaine, it's 20%. With THC, cannabis, it's 30%. And that's the greatest deduction that they make. Nearly 1/3 of the result is knocked off before they hand that result to the police. So if you've got the results in front of you, telling you that you're over the legal limit for cannabis, then that result would have actually been 30% higher than the result that you've been given. Now, it's really important to check whether the laboratory have deducted the correct amount for analytical variation, or indeed any amount whatsoever. And the reason mistakes can be made is because up until 2015, the laboratory didn't have to make any deduction for analytical variation. They just reported the result as it was shown, and they handed that result to the police. Things changed with the new offence, Section 5, drug driving, in 2015, and it's now necessary to make that deduction. So important to check whether that has happened, because if they've not deducted the correct amount, then you may be wrongly charged and potentially wrongly convicted of an offence that you haven't committed, when the result would have been under the legal limit, but instead it's showing as being over. The second issue to check is the laboratory's use of blank solvents. Your sample is tested in a batch of 18. That means that there's usually a test before your blood sample, probably a test after your blood sample. In between the tests, the laboratory should inject a blank solvent, and the blank solvent clears the instrument of any residue left over from the previous test. The difficulty is, this is only guidance issued by the Forensic Science Regulator. It's not yet a requirement. And because the laboratories are private companies, they're trying to turn a profit, they want to be as efficient, they want to analyse as many blood samples as they can in the shortest amount of time, because they get paid for each blood sample that they test. Injecting blank solvents can slow that process down, and that's why some labs will stay clear of this method. Now, the potential problem is where there's a sample containing a very high concentration of some drug that's analysed just before yours. If there's no blank solvent in between the two tests, then a proportion of that drug from the previous test is carried over and injected into yours. Now, of course, that can falsely elevate the result of your test, or it may produce a complete false positive. Had there been a blank solvent in between, that would have cleared the instrument and that avoids the problem. But again, this is only guidance, it's not yet a requirement. The final issue relates to how the laboratory actually calculates the result. Because your blood sample isn't just tested once, it might be tested 2, 3, 4 or 5 times. The question is, did the lab pick the lowest result? Did they calculate a mean average? Did they pick the highest result? And at which point do they deduct the amount for analytical variation? So at which point do they knock off that percentage? Did they knock it from the highest result, a mean average, the lowest result? And different labs use a slightly different method, and that can create a lot of unfairness because your blood sample could be sent to one lab that picks the highest figure as opposed to another lab which chooses the lowest. Somebody is charged, the other person with potentially the same amount in their blood isn't charged. There's a lot of unfairness and there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. And that's why it's always important to check how that sample was analysed and how that result was calculated and at what point they deducted the amount for analytical variation. I hope this video has been helpful and I hope it gives you an idea as to the potential problems that apply with blood samples in drug driving cases. If you do have any other questions, of course, you can get in contact. All our initial advice is completely free of charge and you'll find our details on our website.